Compared to the grand geopolitical spectacles of the past, the 2026 annual Victory Day parade in Red Square was defined by what was missing. The traditional thundering columns of main battle tanks and mobile ICBM launchers did not roll past the Kremlin walls. Instead, the public watched them on massive LED screens. The reason: a localized asymmetrical paralysis. Ukrainian long-range strike drones were actively threading through Moscow's layered air defense networks, forcing the Russian high command to ground all static displays out of fear of a decapitation strike in front of global cameras. Only days prior, the Solnechnogorsk oil facility and the highly fortified Moscow refinery, supposedly protected by Russia's premier strategic air defense networks, were engulfed in black smoke. Commercial aviation across the Western Russian Federation came to a complete standstill. Robert Brody, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, summarized the new reality in 6 cold words: Moscow from now on never sleeps. How did the world's self-proclaimed second most powerful military find itself in a state of operational paralysis against an adversary it expected to conquer within 72 hours? The superficial answer is drones. But military science tells a different story. Russia did not lose this campaign on the muddy fields of the Donbass or the outskirts of Kyiv. It lost it in the planning rooms of the General Staff before a single soldier crossed the border on February 24, 2022. It was the original sin of arrogance, a catastrophic failure of strategic assumption that triggered an irreversible chain of doctrinal failures. To understand the current stagnation, we must dissect the operational architecture of the initial invasion. The entire Russian campaign was built upon a fragile logistical foundation, the assumption of a 10-day collapse. Soviet legacy deep battle theory dictates that an offensive must strike the entire depth of an enemy's operational structure simultaneously to cause systemic paralysis. However, the Russian General Staff converted this doctrine into a political fantasy. Logistics planners prepared supply chains tailored exclusively for a short sprint. They assumed that once the capital fell, the political will of the Ukrainian state would evaporate, rendering sustained combat operations unnecessary. Consequently, armor columns ran out of fuel, and mechanized infantry lacked rations, not because Russian supply lines were inherently incompetent, but because the system was never engineered for a protracted war of attrition. Furthermore, the initial invasion force, ranging between 150,000 and 190,000 personnel, was mathematically absurd for an objective of this scale. To successfully occupy and pacify a hostile nation of over 40 million people, military doctrine dictates a force-to-population ratio that Russia completely ignored. For comparison, during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the Allied coalition deployed nearly 700,000 troops to liberate Kuwait, a territory a fraction of the size of Ukraine. Russia attempted to conquer Europe's second-largest country with less than a quarter of that density, operating on the flawed intelligence that the Ukrainian territorial defense forces would not mobilize. But Ukraine was no longer the military of 2014. For 8 years under Western and NATO advisory programs, Kyiv had quietly executed a profound institutional transformation. While Russia retained the rigid top-down command structure of the Soviet era, Ukraine deliberately adopted the Western philosophy of mission command. Ukraine broke this paradigm. They decentralized authority down to the company and battalion levels. Ukrainian junior officers were trained to analyze the commander's intent, evaluate local terrain, and make autonomous tactical decisions without waiting for permission from a distant brigade headquarters. When the initial Russian thrust failed to secure the critical gateway of Hostomel Airport on day 1, the entire Russian synchronized machine ground to a halt. Stranded in the famous 40-mile convoy north of Kyiv, Russian commanders faced localized ambushes they were doctrinally unequipped to counter. Because their system concentrated authority at the apex, senior Russian officers were forced to physically move to the front lines to manage minor tactical bottlenecks. Ukrainian intelligence weaponized this flaw, systematically hunting command and control vehicles. The resulting loss of high-ranking Russian general officers in the opening weeks shattered the cohesion of the invading forces. The second structural pillar of Russian military doctrine is the assumption of air superiority. Combined arms operations require the Russian aerospace forces, the VKS, to suppress enemy air defenses, isolate the battlefield, and provide close air support. Russian ground formations are quite literally designed to fight under a protective air umbrella, yet the VKS failed to secure the skies for a single day. In the opening phase, Russia launched over 1,100 precision ballistic and cruise missiles to neutralize Ukraine's radar networks and surface-to-air missile batteries. But utilizing decentralized mobile tactics, Ukrainian air defense units had already dispersed their legacy S-300 and Buk systems into hidden positions. As a result, the VKS found itself flying sophisticated multi-role fighters like the Su-35 into a highly lethal, contested environment. Depleting their stockpiles of precision-guided munitions much faster than industrial capacity could replace them, Russian pilots were forced to conduct low-altitude strikes, bringing them directly into the engagement envelopes of thousands of Western-supplied man-portable air defense systems manpads. By late spring 2022, the VKS had effectively abandoned deep penetration missions, retreating to launch standoff weapons from within safe Russian airspace. Without close air support, Russian infantry and armor were exposed to relentless artillery fire, and Western logistical pipelines into Ukraine remained entirely uninterrupted. As the conflict transitioned into a brutal war of attrition by mid-2022, Russia faced an industrial crisis. It could not innovate its way out of the technology blockade. Within hours of the invasion, an unprecedented multinational sanctions regime cut off the Russian defense sector from the global semiconductor market. To bridge the critical gap in modern capabilities, Moscow was forced to compromise its geopolitical standing by relying on external actors. It turned to Iran for low-cost Shahed loitering munitions and to North Korea for millions of unguided artillery shells. Russia had transformed from a global arms exporter into an industrial supplicant. By 2026, the evolution of unmanned systems completely rewrote the rules of engagement. This drone war is fought across three distinct operational domains: the frontline tactical fight, the operational interdiction zone, and the strategic deep strike campaign. On the front lines, in the middle strike domain extending up to 130 miles behind the front lines, Ukraine has weaponized heavy domestic platforms like the FP2 drone to execute a systematic interdiction campaign. By early 2026, Ukrainian strikes targeting Russian air defense radars and mobile electronic jamming systems increased by 300%. This created a compounding vulnerability. Each air defense system destroyed left a gap in the radar network, making the next drone strike even more effective. Russian ammunition depots and critical command nodes have been forced to retreat deep into sovereign Russian territory, overextending their already strained logistics. This brings us to the strategic deep strike campaign. Through indigenous startups like Firepoint, Ukraine has scaled production of the long-range FP1 drone and the Flamingo cruise missile capable of hitting targets 1,800 miles away. By striking key infrastructure deep within the Ural Mountains, Kyiv forced a drop of nearly 400,000 barrels per day in Russian crude production in early 2026, directly draining the Kremlin's primary economic engine. Simultaneously, Ukraine inverted the traditional cost exchange equation of air defense. Historically, the attacker has the economic advantage as interceptor missiles cost far more than the drones they shoot down. Russia attempted to exploit this by launching massive waves of Shahed drones to deplete Ukraine's Western missile stockpiles. The final irreversible failure for Moscow is the collapse of its domestic economic stability. The original social contract between the Kremlin and the Russian public was based on insulation. The conflict was categorized as a distant special military operation that would not disrupt civilian life in major urban centers. By 2026, that illusion was completely shattered. Constant drone strikes, airport closures, and fuel shortages have brought the reality of the war directly to the Russian population. To fund a massive $190 billion military budget, consuming nearly 40% of all federal expenditure, the Kremlin was forced to raise VAT rates and maintain restrictive interest rates that are actively crippling the civilian economy. Truth: Russia did not fail because it lacked raw military mass. It failed because its rigid, overconfident doctrine was fundamentally incompatible with the reality of modern peer-to-peer warfare. It chose to launch a short-term political gamble instead of an overwhelming, sustainable military operation, and by the time it recognized the scale of its mistake, the window for strategic correction had slammed shut. Every month that passes, Ukraine's automated industrial complex iterates faster, while Russia's access to critical technology grows more restricted. The battlefield has become a live-fire laboratory where asymmetry systematically dismantles sheer mass. The empty skies over the Victory Day parade were not just a temporary security precaution. They were a visual testament to a crumbled military doctrine. Moscow thought it could conquer an empire in a weekend. Instead, it ensured that from now on, Moscow never sleeps. For more detailed daily analytical breakdowns of the changing face of modern geopolitics and military technology, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next briefing.